Welcome to the Report Card with Nat Malkus, the education podcast from the American Enterprise Institute, where we evaluate research, policy, and practice efforts to improve the lives of families, students, and schools. Since the first charter school opened in 1992, we've been arguing about them. Now, proponents of charters often argue that they have more autonomy for schools, a better structural arrangement, and that they put up impressive numbers in terms of test scores and graduation rates. Opponents sometimes will take issues with these numbers, but more often, they take issue with how charters achieve these numbers. Today, we're going to talk with two guests who make the case for charters and chartering. First, we'll talk to Cara Stillings Candal, Senior Fellow at the Pioneer Institute and author of the recent book, The Fight for the Best Charter Schools in the Nation. Now, it seems to me that every charter proponent has their favorite city to draw on. A lot look to New Orleans or Washington, D.C., but Cara looks to a state. She says Massachusetts has the best charter schools in the nation because they have strong authorizing that developed over time. She comes to talk to us about her argument for Massachusetts charter schools and what other states can learn from the Bay State. Then we'll talk with David Osborne. He's the director of the Reinventing America's Schools project at the Progressive Policy Institute and author of Reinventing America's Schools. David goes beyond calls for more charter schools. David's calling for more chartering, period. Both for charters, of course, but also for traditional public school districts. We'll hear from David after our conversation right now with Cara Stillings Candal. Cara Stillings Candal, thanks for coming on the Report Card.
Thank you for having me.
So, Cara, you're from Massachusetts, and in your new book, The Fight for the Best Charter Schools in the Nation, you talk about the Massachusetts experience with charter schools, and you make a pretty big claim that they're the best charter schools in the nation. So give me the elevator pitch for your book.
Yeah, it is a big claim. It's a claim that I like to say is driven by the data. So as you already know, we have several high-quality studies to show not only that Massachusetts has an incredibly high-performing charter sector, but that Boston in particular, where most of our charter schools are located, that charter sector closes achievement gaps at unprecedented rates nationally. So we've known this from very high quality gold standard studies back as far as 2009. And then as early as 2015, Credo out of Stanford, not necessarily a gold standard study as you and I would describe it, was showing that Boston's charter schools as a group are closing achievement gaps at these unprecedented rates, adding years of learning to students' educations, to those who choose to consume charters. So that's the claim for the book. One of the things that we hope to do here is to help folks understand, according to my research, why we think Boston grew such a high-performing charter sector. That doesn't mean that there aren't lessons learned for how to make it better, because we have one of the highest performing but also the slowest growing charter sectors in the nation, and that's due to our very contentious environment around charter school politics in this state.
It's interesting because, I talk to folks about charter schools, and lots of people have their favorite home base for charters. So I live in D.C., where we are almost half charter, one of the fastest improving districts in the nation by some accounts. Of course, others love Denver. There's folks that love New Orleans, which is almost 100% charter. So why Massachusetts? I mean, what is it that Massachusetts has that's made its charter sector so strong?
Well, I love all of those charter sectors, too, I have to say. Real quick, I've got a friend from Denver who has a kid in a charter school, and she didn't even realize it was a charter school. And that's one of the reasons I love Denver's charter schools. That would never happen here. Why Massachusetts? I think that, listen, we can talk a lot about the social capital that exists here in this relatively wealthy state. We can talk about the fact that all you need to do is, throw a stone and you can hit any of really some of the best universities in the whole country that can produce really eager ed entrepreneurs and teachers to work in our charter sector. But really what I outline in the book is this idea that our authorizer, the state, has really held true to what some would describe as this charter school bargain. And that has helped our charter sector really to flourish because the state has always given our charter schools real autonomy to serve students in the ways that they think they can do best. And on the other hand, it's always closed those schools when they fail to perform up to expectation or to meet the terms of their charter. So I think that that's one of the big lessons that a lot of places, even some of those that you mentioned, I would say if we look at New Orleans, some claim that there's been a little too much regulation going on, that, you know, our charter sector has really not seeing some of the types of regulation and some of the autonomy taken away that we've witnessed in other places.
Well, this is interesting. If you notice all those other places that I mentioned, they were districts, and that wasn't on purpose. Yep. Usually we talk about sort of charter districts, but you're talking about Massachusetts charters, using the state as the unit of analysis. Is that purposeful? Was it the state of Massachusetts, or was it Boston?
It is purposeful. So Boston is our largest charter school sector. It's the place where we have most demand, and it's also, our most densely populated urban center. So we have a lot of charter schools there. But the unit of analysis here is the state, because what I argue in the book is that no place in Massachusetts, Boston included, would have grown such a high-performing charter sector if our authorizer wasn't doing things right. I traced the history of charter school authorizing in Massachusetts from the very beginning, when we had a cap of just 25 charter schools. And I argue that cap in many ways played an important role in how our authorizer sort of came to do what it does, in that they had to really make some really important decisions early on about the approach that it would take to authorizing. So in the beginning, it didn't want to put its thumb on the scale in terms of like what type of school might work. We saw a real diversity of innovative school options, geographically diverse too, I might add. And over time, though, it came to be much better at understanding what schools might be likely to produce the best outcomes for kids. And then it took this conservative approach and basically told charter operators, now it's in your hands. Show us what you've got. And then, as I said, close them down when they fail to perform. So it's the state, I argue, that has really done things right. And to be clear, we've had Boston charter schools that have failed as well, but that's because the state has held them to account.
Right. So you're not saying, hey, charter schools are better than traditional schools. You're saying that the sector as a whole, driven by good authorizing, is bringing up scores and bringing up productivity. It sounds like the Massachusetts charter sector really was birthed out of Boston. But what about some of your other struggling locales? I'm thinking Lawrence, Holyoke, Springfield. These are tough towns when it comes to public schooling.
These are tough towns. And we've got some really excellent charter operators in all of those places. It's been interesting because, on the one hand, I would say one of the things that we haven't done well here in Massachusetts, and that I would argue our authorizer, perhaps if we're a little more independent, could do a better job of, is incenting in some ways charter operators, not only existing operators, but new operators with innovative ideas, to go to these places outside of Boston where, for example, it's harder to attract teachers, where, for example, students and families are facing different sets of needs than we see here in the state's largest urban center. But we have had success in these places, and I'll point to one, what I think is a really interesting story here in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Our pretty newly appointed Commissioner of Education, Jeff Riley, was the receiver in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Just up until about a year ago, the state had put Lawrence into receivership for chronic underperformance. And Commissioner Riley came in, and what he did was he borrowed not only a lot of lessons from sort of our authorizer, from the way charter schools are authorized, he borrowed a lot of lessons from specific charter schools themselves. So he went in and he said in Lawrence that what he was going to do was give district schools, in many cases, very charter-like autonomies, but on the other end of the coin, he was going to hold them accountable when they failed to perform. So school leaders were very accountable for results, even though they had more autonomy to do the things that they knew how to do best. He also leveraged existing charter operators. One I'll point to is the Phoenix Charter Academies. There's a small charter network that we have here in the Commonwealth. They're located in Springfield, Lawrence, and in Chelsea, Mass. And their whole reason for being is to serve chronically disengaged students, so students who either have already dropped out of school or at risk of doing so. Jeff invited Phoenix into Lawrence and said, I want you to be a part of the district, but I'm going to try and give you as many charter-like autonomies as I can, because I think that this innovative model that you have is really great for Lawrence. He also went to, for example, the Match Charter Public School, which has campuses here in Boston. And he said to Match, I want to borrow your one-to-one tutoring model. Teach me how to do that. I want to inject that into the district. And Lawrence has seen a real improvement over time in students' results. So, right now it looks like his ideas were working pretty well. I will say very importantly that some of those charter operators he brought in and asked to become part of the district have since backed away and said, I can really only do my job when I have full autonomy. which in many cases means my teachers don't have to be part of a union because I need to have control over who's on my staff.
So it sounds like Riley's interested in bringing in some of these operators, but as far as the effective authorizing that built a strong statewide system, what do you think other states need to pay attention to and learn from Massachusetts?
So I think that there are a couple key things. And first is that no matter where our authorizer has existed, it's always been the state, but it's been in a couple different offices. They've always done a pretty darn good job of holding true to this idea that charters need real autonomy in order to do things differently and in order to do things well. And that means freedom from regulation. Now, I would argue that we've seen a little bit of regulatory creep, but not as bad as in a lot of other places nationally. But on the other side of the coin, our authorizer has also always really held up the bargain that we will close you. We will shut you down, charter school operator, if you fail to perform or live up to the expectations of your charter. The other key here is that in Massachusetts, we do a pretty darn good job of funding our charter public schools. So money for charter schools follows the child here. When a kid leaves the district for a charter school, that money that was designated for him or her follows him or her to the charter. Now, we don't get full facilities funding, which is unequitable and difficult and ultimately makes charter operators do more with less, so to speak. The other thing we do that is really unique in the nation, Nat, depending on the day, I have mixed feelings about this, is we reimburse our districts when students leave for charters. We reimburse our district schools for a period of 6 years and to the tune of up to 225% of the one-time cost of a kid leaving to go to a charter. Now, it can be a bit of a double-edged sword because you can argue, why should we pay districts for kids that they're no longer educating? Shouldn't we help them figure out how to right size on their own? But the other side of that is you don't want any kids or schools to suffer when, say, a new charter school opens down the street and a lot of people want their kid to go there. You know, districts do have to right size, and that can take a little bit of time. So I think that our funding formula is worthy of emulation, perhaps with a few tweaks, but it's autonomy in exchange for accountability and money for chartering following the child so that we have comparatively very equitable funding for our charter public schools.
Well, the other benefit that you have for this sort of reimbursements to public schools that lose students to charters is that you take care of all the political intrigue and politics around charters in the state, right?
I wish that were the case. One would think that we do, but the 2016 ballot initiative that charter supporters to lift the charter school cap resoundingly lost is proof, well, of a couple things, including the fact that charter proponents ran a poor campaign and didn't do a good job of explaining the funding formula. Right. But it's also evidence that, your average citizen, and certainly I think your average voter, especially if he or she is using a, for example, suburban district school that they are pleased with, isn't going to take a whole lot of time to try and understand what is ultimately not an incredibly transparent funding formula. So we spend like a whole chapter in the book following the money, so to speak, and it was hard for my economist colleague, Ken Arden, to parse out, let alone, my mother-in-law. So it hasn't shut down the argument about politics, but I have faith that in the near future, those of us who want to see the cap lifted will find a way to make that funding formula more transparent, and will find a way to really explain to people the true impacts of charters on traditional public schools, which studies show, and a new one in Education Next recently shows is actually really positive, that charters have positive impacts on districts.
I want to put a pin in the cap for just a moment, because I'm interested in the perception of charters in Massachusetts, right? So politics, a lot of it is just carried in perception. In your studies, what do people think of when you say charter schools? I mean, what is the mental picture that sort of serves as the foundation for the political back and forth over charters in Massachusetts?
Yeah. So one of the things I outlined in the book is that I spent a lot of time talking to different folks, including a lot of parents, both parents of charter school students and parents of district school students. And one of the things that became really clear to me is that charters have a reputation that is very much linked to this no excuses model of schooling, even though charter schools here in Massachusetts are by no means all no excuses. And many that, quite frankly, at one time or another adopted that moniker would like to disassociate themselves from it. Charters have come to have this reputation as being a way of doing school instead of a structure that allows diverse and innovative types of schools to flourish. And that was kind of disheartening to me. And they also, due to some quirks in our law, they have a reputation for being about one kind of community, about serving one kind of kid, and in that, about being an escape valve from failing school districts, right? So back in 2010, in response to Race to the Top, we rejiggered our charter law to get a modest increase in the cap in low-performing school districts. And one of the things we did was we said only proven providers or operators with an existing track record of running schools can open new schools when the charter cap is listed in these areas. And what that led to here was this replication of certain schools, albeit high-performing schools, good schools, but replication as opposed to innovation. And so parents reported to me this perception of a narrowing of options in the charter school space. I had one parent who had, I think, 2 kids in charter schools at very different sort of eras in the charter school movement say, you know, in the beginning, we felt that these were really, truly different options, that you had this diverse array of options and you could figure out what was best for your kid. And now I feel like, well, I get one choice, and that is I send my kid to this school that's very structured and college, test. So I think that what we did in 2010 has really been to the detriment of perceptions of charter schools as being about replication rather than innovation.
Let me advocate for the devil here in this argument for a minute. I know that a lot of people are going to say, yes, Boston, we've worked wonders in Boston and Massachusetts. But part of the reason that the charter cap fight went against the charters and for the union interests was because charters in Boston work, but they don't work in the leafy suburbs of Massachusetts, which is where most of the political power is, which is where the constituency is, and which is where the teachers union was able to marshal its resources to pretty resoundingly defeat the cap. Is that true? I mean, is there some truth to that? And where do the roots of that disconnect lie?
Well, I would say that it would be true if we actually had charters at any sort of scale in our leafy suburbs. You know, the truth of the matter is that, you know, Massachusetts loves to pat itself on the back for having very high-performing schools, period. And we do. We have some very high-performing district schools, many of them located in suburban districts. And one of the ways in which I think our charter sector has really failed is that we've done nothing to incent operators to offer new, innovative options in the suburbs. Because when you have already high-performing schools, it's going to take something really special to get parents to say, hey, I want to send my kid to that charter school down the street, which, by the way, is one of the things that charter schools were supposed to do. And so, for example, we do have some very high-performing charters. One that comes to mind is called AMSA, American Math and Science Academy. It's a regional charter school that draws from many of our leafy suburbs, and they've proven to offer something to parents that the district schools are not. So therefore, their enrollment's good. But I think there is some credence to this argument that, you know, it was suburban voters who were making decisions for good or for ill at the ballot box for a lot of charter consumers. Now, noted, we didn't just lose the ballot question in the leafy suburbs. I think those perceptions also got even to some consumers of charter schools.
So I'm interested to get your take on the cap, which on the one hand you say, well, we lost on this cap vote. It should have been lifted. But you also say the cap served a good purpose. How does that work? What was the benefit of the cap?
Well, the benefit of the cap was that in the early days of chartering, so Massachusetts was among the first to have a charter school law, and we didn't have many places to look to. And the cap, of course, was the result not of good intentions about let's get this authorizing thing right. It was the result of political sausage making during our Education Reform Act.
Sure.
But, you know, I think in the beginning we had such a conservative cap that the state had to figure out, okay, you know, if we want this thing to succeed, we need to figure out how to authorize not only innovative schools to give parents real choice, but also schools that are kind of going to work. And how do you do that by focusing on outcomes rather than inputs so you're not overregulating all these things? And I think that the cap forced a really conservative approach to authorizing in the beginning. And so once they sort of figured out, hey, this formula of, okay, looking for these qualities in certain proposals, be it the ability to ensure that a school is going to be financially stable, or, you know, how are you going to show us, you know, who you're going to bring in to help you create this new and innovative curriculum that you're thinking about. I think our authorizer learned to ask prospective operators the right questions. And they also, as I said, held true to this idea that when those schools, even in the early days, weren't performing, they needed to close down. And so that gave us a template for authorizing that valued autonomy and accountability, but really got us to a place where we could say, okay, we know not only how to figure out if a proposal is likely to succeed, and again, it could be anything from a Montessori school to a no excuses school, but what features of the proposal make that likely to succeed? And then to support in the renewal process, in the charter renewal process, to hold schools accountable in a supportive way. I mean, we have a pretty hands-on process here, not in terms of regulation, but in terms of schools always having to show themselves of, okay, here's the progress we're making, here's what we're doing. Our authorizer does a good job of that. And now that we know what we're doing, though, I would argue that the cap has really outlived its usefulness. We know that we have a pretty strong authorization process, and we've seen charters work at scale in other places. So it's really time for us to consider what it's going to take to abolish this cap once and for all.
Well, Cara, thanks for coming on the podcast. It's an interesting book. I encourage people to read The Fight for the Best Charter Schools in the Nation. Thanks for coming on the report card.
Thanks so much for having me. I had a great time.
Cara made her case for why Massachusetts charters are worth emulating. She talks a lot about the authorizing structure and the way it gives autonomy, how they built up their practices to replicate good charters. But could this work for more than charter schools? David Osborne thinks so. So we brought him in to have a talk with me about whether chartering is a good basis for reinventing America's schools. David Osborne of the Progressive Policy Institute, welcome to the report card.
Thank you. Appreciate your having me.
Yeah, so David, you wrote this compelling book, and you put out this meek title, Reinventing America's Schools, like that. Set the stage here. When you were writing this book, what was the problem that you were setting out to solve?
Well, I think everyone knows that for the last 2 or 3 or 4 decades, our urban public school systems have really struggled. The majority of kids going through them don't come out the other end ready for college or a career. So, there are many reasons. Obviously, poverty is a big reason. Obviously, racism has something to do with it. The descendants of slaves are at a huge disadvantage. But I think the systems also are at fault. We're using a way of organizing public education that's a century old. And when we left the industrial era behind and went into the information age, so much changed that our public school systems need to change too. And unfortunately, they were built to be very stable bureaucracies. They deliver standardized services, the same kind of education to every child. That's how they were built anyway. It's changing, but that's how they were built a century ago. And they were monopolies. And they're very hard to change. So they are slowly adapting, but not nearly fast enough. And I think that's the core problem that we're dealing with.
I get your point. We've had academic generation after academic generation suffering in these schools. And if they're going to continue to struggle, how many generations will we wait before marginal solutions will come forward? So what's your pitch? How should we reinvent the schools?
Well, if you look at which cities have improved the fastest over the last decade or so, number 1 is New Orleans. Number 2 is Washington, D.C. And the next 2 might be, it's hard to compare, but might be Chicago and Denver. And then you ask, what's common about those? What's common is they've embraced charter schools. They've embraced a different way of organizing the public education system. And just to use the most extreme example, New Orleans now, well, in another year or two, 100% of their public schools will be charter schools. So it's just a different way to organize the system. It's giving the people who run schools real autonomy to make the key decisions.
Well, David, let me just interrupt you. Let's just say for our listeners, really briefly, what are charter schools?
Good point. Charter schools are public schools that have a great deal of autonomy. They still have to follow some rules. They can't discriminate on the basis of race or other things. But most of the rules, state rules and district rules, don't apply to them. So the people who run the charter school get to figure out who to hire, who to fire, how much to pay them, how to use their budgets, what kind of educational program, what kind of learning program to use, and all the other decisions that go into a school.
They get a lot of autonomy, and what's on the exchange?
Autonomy, and then in exchange, they're held accountable. Now, I have to admit, there are states that have failed to do this well, like Michigan is a classic example. But in places like New Orleans, D.C., Denver, Chicago, if you're running a charter school, and after 3 or 4 or 5 years, your kids are falling further behind grade level every year, you're going to be closed. And you might be replaced by another operator in that building. So the kids, it's not that the school will necessarily close, but as an operator, you're gone. So they're actually held accountable, which is critical. They're also usually schools of choice. That is, parents get to choose them. They're not assigned to them. And the money usually follows the choice so that these schools create competition in the system. That's essentially what a charter school is.
So this reminds me of something that had a large place in your former book from years ago, Reinventing Government. I guess after you've reinvented government, reinventing public schools is sort of a chump change. But in Reinventing Government, you made this distinction between government's role in rowing and steering. And I think that that's a pretty good metaphor for understanding the difference between charter and sort of traditional public schools. So can you lay out the rowing and steering difference?
Absolutely. So in a traditional school district, particularly 50 years ago when I was a boy, everybody who worked in a school or drove a school bus worked for the same organization. It's one organization. So a school district did the steering, that is, setting direction, setting policy, figuring out if you got the right mix of schools, figuring out what's your discipline policy going to be, what's your enrollment policy going to be, all of those steering questions. And they also operated the schools. They did the rowing. It's very hard to do both well, and that's part of the problem with our system. In a charter environment, there's an authorizer who could be a district in some cases, or might be something like the Public Charter School Board in Washington, D.C., appointed by the mayor. That body steers. It deals with the questions of direction, mix of schools, policy, any rules around discipline or anything else. The rowing is all done by the people who run the schools.
Let me ask you a question about the argument in the book. Are you arguing we should just have more charters, or are you arguing for more chartering?
For more chartering. I want to convince people to quit thinking about charter schools as an innovation around the edges of the public school system and thinking that that's all they'll ever be, and help them realize that, no, we could actually organize our public school districts this way.
This reminds me of a quote from Kaya Henderson, and she said, "I'm so sick of people telling me that charter schools are eating my lunch. Give me the autonomy that charters have, and let me show you what we can do in DCPS." And I always found that was interesting coming from the top of a district.
Absolutely, and I wish the city council had let her do that. They thought seriously about it, about the time she was saying that, or quoted as saying that, and they didn't go in that direction. But I think that's what D.C. needs. I mean, Washington, D.C. public schools, the district, has gone through profound reforms. Everybody remembers Michelle Rhee 10 years ago coming in and shaking everything up and laying a lot of people off and closing a lot of schools. They have continued for a decade to do a lot of reform, but in the poorest communities, in Ward 7 and 8 in D.C., the charters still just clean their clocks. The charters are so much stronger. And I think it's because when you have kids who are 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years behind grade level, having a world-class curriculum doesn't help you. D.C. does have a world-class curriculum, but you have to throw it out and meet the kids where they are. You might have to lengthen your school day. You might need to do Saturday sessions. You might need to lengthen your school year. And a district school doesn't have the autonomy to do any of those things.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up Michelle Rhee. I was here in D.C., where I live, when Rhee was coming in making a lot of changes. She caught a lot of static for a lot of the things that she did. Understandably, it makes me wonder if instead of rowing and steering, if she did more steering and let some of those changes take place at more local levels, whether it would have been easier to get more buy-in and also tailor some of those reforms.
I think she would have been wiser to do more chartering and less centralized management, but, that's the choice she made. I think that the next chancellor in D.C. should essentially ask the strongest charters operators available to take over some of the lowest performing schools in Ward 7 and 8 and run them as charters.
So, David, let me advocate for the devil here for a moment on some of your arguments. So, I've been paying attention to school reform for some time. I remember that people were saying, in the 80s, Atlanta is the city that's really beating it up on school reform. And then it sort of petered out. Maybe Houston in the 90s. Atlanta came back up in the late 2000s. We've had D.C. come up, and also we've had some trouble with DCPS in the past couple of years. That we see this pattern in a lot of these school districts where we say, well, they're the exemplar of the 5-year period, and then we have some things that fall out. Well, you use several examples here: Denver, New Orleans, D.C., and I wonder, number one, how much can we trust the progress that we're seeing in these places, and how do you not fall prey to the same assumption that we've seen this increase and that we can move the lessons that appear to have been learned in these special cases and push them out across the board?
Well, to answer the first part of that, New Orleans has been studied left, right, and center, and a lot of people tell a lot of lies about New Orleans, but the truth is the improvements are real. They're not because of demographic changes, and they're the most rapid that the academic experts have ever seen in a public school system. D.C., I've looked at a ton of data, and I think the gains there in the charter sector are real. Obviously, some of the graduation data in the district was not real. There's been a scandal around that. I could go through Denver as well, Chicago. I mean, they've been studied pretty carefully. Now, why is it that traditional districts make progress and then fall back? I've been working with public organizations ever since I wrote Reinventing Government, which is 27 years ago now. We see this constantly. You get a good leader, they begin to empower their employees, they begin to decentralize, they begin to expect innovation, reward innovation, and you get a period of creativity and improvement. Then the leader leaves. Leaders aren't permanent. They leave, and the bureaucratic nature of the system just reasserts itself, and you begin to lose your best people. Why won't that happen in a charter sector? I think, one, because the schools do have real autonomy by law. It's very difficult for an authorizer to re-centralize control. Secondly, the schools are in competition with each other, and the worst ones get closed in these systems I'm talking about. Everybody who works in a school knows that they don't have a job for life. They have a job until that next renewal period, and if they're good enough, they'll get another 5 years, or another 7 years, or another 10 years, depending on the state law.
I get that, and maybe the changes aren't so fundamental in these other cities that we've seen, whereas, chartering really is sort of changing the structure. That raised another question. So around the time you were writing Reinventing Government, there were these two guys that came out with this book on how to solve schools, and they wrote something that sort of resonates with things you're saying. They wrote this sentence: reformers fail to solve the problem with schools because the institutions are the problem. Of course, that was Chubb and Moe, and they had a solution that they said, was literally a panacea, and that's private school choice. Now, you seem to be saying, yeah, the institutions are the problem, but you're certainly not advocating private school choice. So can you tell me, first of all, do you agree with the sentiment that the institutions are the problem? And if so, why do you think private school choice is a dead end?
I do agree. I think their analysis of the failures was right on. There were a lot of good things about their book. And I have no problem with vouchers for poor kids, where you're actually expanding opportunity for that family and that child. But here's my problem with saying, as Chubb and Moe did, that we ought to just voucherize the entire system. Everybody should just get a voucher and take it to any public or private school. Imagine if that happened. Let's say the voucher for middle school was worth $10,000 a child in a particular city. Most people would not be able to afford to add to that, but some people would. So some people would buy, because we all love our children, we all want the best for them. We would want the best school we could afford for them. So some of us would buy $20,000 schools. Some of us would buy $30,000 schools. Some people would even spend $40,000 a year on a school for their child. And our education system, which is already stratified by income, would stratify even more. It would gradually become like any market. we would have Mercedes schools and BMW schools and Cadillac schools and Chevy schools and Ford schools. And then for most working people, we'd have used car schools. And I think that would be a disaster for America. I believe deeply that choice and competition create much healthier incentives, but I want to do it within a public system where we can create and enforce equal opportunity.
That does make sense. Certainly a coherent critique, one that needs to be considered deeply. Let me ask you about flipping the coin. You said voucherizing the whole system is a problem. What about charterizing the whole system? I mean, is that viable? Is that what we want to do? And I think that right off the bat, you can say, well, charterizing Montana public schools is probably not going to work because it's just not dense enough to carry on competition like that. But even in large urban districts, should we charterize the whole thing?
I want to make clear, I am talking mostly about urban districts and big suburban districts. And my answer is yes. Absolutely. And frankly, I believe that in another 30 years, this will be the norm. Now, in rural districts, small towns, maybe not. I lived for 25 years in a small town of 3,000 people with one elementary and middle school and one high school. And in those towns, everything is personal relationships. It's hard for me to see in that environment, people saying, well, no, you're not cutting the mustard, so we're going to let you all go and contract with a different operator for our school. I'm not sure that'll ever happen in small town America.
Right. If you look at the outcomes of small town and particularly rural schools, they're actually pretty good. A lot of people think, oh, well, there's all these challenges with rural schools, but they certainly don't have the kind of challenges in the outcome measures that we see, especially in urban districts. We also had a talk with Cara Stillings Candal about Massachusetts charters. She brought up a point that I wanted to get your take on. She said they had this cap. She doesn't like the cap. She thinks it needs to go away, but she said it was useful early on. It was useful for Massachusetts to figure out what they were doing to get their chartering system running well. And that now, of course, there's a problem with this cap, but originally it had that use of streamlining the transition. If we're going to charterize entire systems, how do we get from, A to Z in that process? It certainly seems like going whole hog is just going to run right into enormous political blowback.
Oh, yeah, and no one's gone whole hog. Even New Orleans, which took about 10 years, they did like 5-6 schools a year. So that's how we're going to do it if we do it. I would agree about the point about Massachusetts in the first maybe 5 years because Massachusetts was something like the fourth state to create a charter law in 1993. Nobody knew how to do it yet. And other states like California, which was second, didn't do a very good job. Their law is kind of flawed. So by having a cap, it meant that the State Department of Education, its charter program went slowly. And we were able to figure out how to do it well and, in fact, became a model for much of the rest of the country. After the first 5 years, though, once we'd figured it out, all the cap does, and by the way, for your listeners, it's no city can spend more than 18% of its public education money on charters. All it does is deny children opportunity.
So in a district that wants to go ahead and make this transition, where should they expect the most opposition?
Well, Nat, as you know, that's an easy one. If there's a teachers union or a teachers association, that's where the most opposition will come from. Because, face it, most public school teachers in this country have tenure. After 2 or 3 years, they get jobs for life. And there's no such thing in the charter world.
Aside from the teachers unions, of course, they're the obvious opposition. We're also asking districts, we're sort of asking the folks who hold the keys to turn over the keys to the schools, at least to turn over the oars. I got to think that that's going to also find a lot of pushback. I can't imagine.
It does, no question. I mean, if you look at a city like Denver, where the district has gradually expanded its charter sector, sort of partnered with charters. They're now up to 23% of the kids in charters and another 22 or 23% in what they call innovation schools, which are schools where they're still district employees and district operated, but they have a lot of the flexibility that charters have. If you look at that, the central office has been one of the biggest obstacles because a school A principal and teacher write an innovation plan. They negotiate with the superintendent. They get it signed. It says that they have all these freedoms, and then they go to exercise them. For example, it says we can purchase our own textbooks. They call the purchasing office. They say, we don't want the standard textbook. Our kids are 3 years behind grade level. These are the textbooks we want. Purchasing office says, oh, we don't work that way. We've already ordered your books. We've already got them. We buy in bulk. You constantly run into the way we've always done it. So, yeah, there's a lot of resistance there, and it's taken Denver a long time to work through that, and they still have further to go. The leaders have to work hard to change the culture of their central bureaucracy.
Well, from your prediction, we got about 30 years to go, so I guess we'll wait and see what happens. David, thanks for coming to talk to us about reinventing America's schools.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Report Card with Nat Malkus, and special thanks to our guests today, Cara Stillings Candal and David Osborne. If you like this episode, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast player. Don't forget to rate us and review us on iTunes or Google, which helps other people find the podcast. If you have any comments, questions, or topic suggestions for future episodes, drop us a line at ed.podcast@aei.org. That's all for this episode. I'm Nat Malkus.